Now, the history of philosophy, Western philosophy, is vast. Discourse in metaphilosophy is Western philosophy, but we can consider other cultural philosophy, African philosophy, uh, Chinese philosophy. Um, so there's many philosophical branches right now. So we're looking at the history of philosophy, but right now I need to, what they call that, give a warning. I don't want, I just want to give a little overview, a brief overview. If you want to get into you should get into the history of philosophy, but you have to do it philosopher by philosopher, work by work, which takes years. So when I say philosophy, I'm giving the overview of the history of philosophy. The overview of philosophy is to understand that Socrates is the father of Western philosophy. Socrates is the father of Western philosophy, but he is not the first philosopher. He is not the first philosopher. He learned philosophy from other philosophers and decided to go a different route. The route he went made philosophy very, very popular and accessible to many people. So he's called the father of philosophy. Philosophers that come before Socrates are called pre-Socratic philosophers, and there are many of them. The pre-Socratic philosophers were actually called, first and foremost, natural philosophers. They was actually looking at nature and try to explain how nature works without appealing to the gods, without saying this God did this God did that. At this moment, they're not saying there are no gods, all right, but they wanted a human explanation for the world around them, all right? And what they were doing, we call natural philosophy. And this is actually the beginning of what you call science, all right? The first what you call philosophers were really first scientists. They were trying to understand nature. Up until the 1800s, scientists called themselves natural philosophers because they were doing the philosophy of nature. Okay. And then as they began to explore nature using logical reasoning, which is what science is, right? They began to go deeper. Okay. They had a belief, all right, that somehow human understanding, okay, our logical reasoning, okay, can lead us to the absolute truth. They discovered a thing they call logos. Nowadays, we call it logic. That if you apply certain rules to your thinking, you can actually get truths that are acceptable, that are validated, we would say today, right? Because in your imagination, you can imagine right now you're on Mars while you're on the planet Earth. You can imagine that. But how would you validate that? They realize when you put logic on your mind, which can go all over the place, you can validate truth. The person who did that for us is known as Thales. We recognize him as the first philosopher from the work of Aristotle, which is closer to Thales' time. And Aristotle says that Thales should be recognized as the first philosopher. He's the first one that went beyond what we call science. Because trying to explain nature and how it works is one thing, but to say where does it all come from was what Thales did. Where does it all come from? And in that moment, he did not appeal to a god. He gave a natural, logical explanation. And in doing so, he began what we call philosophy proper, right? Philosophy proper. This is how it began, but quickly things began to fall apart. As people began to realize these philosophers, these natural philosophers trying to explain nature, their own logical reasoning, that these began to conflict with one another. A contradiction seemed to have emerged. Okay, one philosopher said this, like Heraclitus, reality is changing. Another philosopher named Parmenides said that reality doesn't change. There seemed to be conflict between these philosophers. A group of critical thinkers who are not called philosophers, but sophists, okay, became aware of this, all right? They were traveling critical thinkers. They were traveling individuals, okay? And they traveled from city state to city state. They gradually came to the idea, to the understanding that truth was relative, okay, in different areas. But when we're looking at religion, it's relative, ethics, different areas they travel, people had different ethical views. Women were like this, men were like this. People in political power had their own rules and how they ran their country. From all these life experiences, these deep critical thinkers realized that truth was relative. When in Rome, do as the Romans. That's the Sophists. When they entered the Athens, where the philosophy was really taking its birth with Socrates and the other philosophers, natural philosophers, what happens was that when they entered into Athens, they began to bring in the same relativity, and they tried to argue that all truths were relative. I mean, because that's what they found. What makes one theory better than the other theory was all about rhetoric. It's all about rhetoric. It wasn't necessarily that it was better than another theory. It's about it sounding good. Okay, it's rhetorical style. If you look at the kind of thing they were looking at religious truth, ethical truth, political truth, and things of that nature. You could see where they get the relativity, because in those areas, it's axiology, as we mentioned before. And so therefore, there's a lot of relativity into it, okay? But they tried to argue that all truths were relative. Pythagoras, one of the most famous ones, had this claim that man is the measure of all things, of things are that they are, of things are not that they are not, okay? So in other words, they try to convince everyone of this truth. Well, it turns out that the people of that time had a problem with these individuals, because what happened is that people like Pythagoras, all of the Sophists here, they were very, very smart, intellectual people. They began to teach other people how to argue in the court system. At that time, there was no attorneys. People defended themselves. And Pythagoras and others showed people how to defend themselves. And the style of these people was this. It doesn't matter who's right or wrong. It's basically who has the best argument. People began furious with the Sophists. It became a negative name. To call someone sophist at that time, up until the modern time, is to say they're intellectually dishonest, okay? Whereas the natural philosophers may have confusion in their work. They weren't being dishonest. It's just that theory led to some confusion. And so the Sophists got a negative connotation. And the philosophy itself would have actually passed and moved out of the consciousness of people, was it not for the next group of philosophers where Socrates came in. Socrates was able to show that although some things are relative, some things are not relative, okay? Some truths are absolutely true, all right?